we go. Well, one question that has shown up in a couple different iterations is about crossing structures, helping the bears cross the road, so to speak, and wondering where crossing structures may be in the works. Some specific mentions from one commenter about connecting the Sapphire and Bitterroot ranges in Ravalli County, or farther north connecting to the Bitterroots over by St. Regis, or down in the Deer Lodge, Whitehall area, getting closer to Yellowstone. So a couple very interesting corridor spots there. I don't know, have either of you heard of crossing structure projects in the works?
I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit, because Vital Ground purchased that chunk of land just adjacent to 90. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that relates to the crossing issue?
Yeah. So Bryce is referring to the 9 Mile area, about 20 miles west of Missoula. Am I right? That's the one you're thinking of, mm-hmm. Bryce? Yeah. And we've called that the Bridge to the Bitterroots project. And it really is kind of a Goldilocks project in terms of location and infrastructure, because on the chunk of habitat that Vital Ground purchased, there is an existing route underneath the I-90 bridge that crosses the Clark Fork right there. So it's a pretty thin strip of land, but Jamie Jonkel from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has documented he's seen a grizzly using this habitat and crossing from the NCDE side across the Clark Fork and going under the strip of land that the highway goes over. So it's a natural underpass that already has documented use.
Way more than one.
And those bears are being bears. They're not going where, our biological goals might want them to go, as one of you mentioned earlier. So they go poke around in the Bitterroot foothills a little bit and come back. At least that's the case for the one that Jamie calls the 9 Mile Grizzly. But that's a great example of a project where a crossing structure, it's not a new overpass or anything, but the infrastructure is already there to provide the route. And Vital Ground was just able to come in and make sure that habitat stays undeveloped, and that we eventually can restore it even to some better high quality habitat, to encourage more crossings, and hopefully a few of them poke around in the Bitterroots long enough to meet a bear coming up from Yellowstone sometime.
And if I remember right, that's a remarkably tiny piece of ground.
Yeah, it's a 20-acre project, if I remember correctly.
Talking Continental Divide ecosystem, we're just a little point.
And that's one of our main approaches at Vital Ground, is just where can we get the most bang for our buck? Where are these keystone corridor areas? And that's certainly one. And as the bears move around more, there may be more opportunities farther south, closer to Yellowstone. And that Big Hole area is a fascinating one, certainly, to keep an eye on.
I know the last thing I would say about crossing structures, I know there's been some discussion about trying to create some better crossing opportunities, whether that's by raising a section of the highway or by doing overpasses or increased underpasses up in the Post Creek area in the Mission Valley on Highway 93. And one of the things that has blown my mind after talking to MDOT folks and tribal natural resources about it, so expensive. The cost of doing anything to a highway is just mind-blowingly expensive and so fraught with regulatory stuff. So we need to pursue those things. But also the reason I mentioned what Matt talked about that Vital Ground is doing, buying those 20 acres is it's such a cheaper and quicker way of doing this. And so I think we also, as these bears expand their range, need to look for every possible opportunity to do that, and every possible opportunity to protect open essential habitat through conservation easements. That's another huge part of this whole picture.
Definitely. And yeah, the financial part is a really important one to keep in mind. That's the reality of it. And use is also an interesting question. You know, we get the question a lot. Our Wild River project up by Troy in the Cabinet Yaak area, it could certainly you could see a crossing go over Highway 2 right there, but it's not an area that any of the biologists have deemed high enough use to really mandate it yet. And so the crossings are a fantastic tool in places where there is really high use, like on Highway 93. But like you said, Bryce, when we can find an alternative, like an existing underpass, and make sure the habitat's protected around that, it's a really great way to avoid the big infrastructure project. Well, our numbers are dropping slightly, but it's great to see so many of you staying on. And thank you, everyone who's attended and provided great questions. As folks are trickling off, I will remind you all, we will be posting a recording of the evening on Vital Ground's YouTube channel, youtube.com/forthegrizzly. And so we'd love to have you share the evening around. And I think we'll just, one more question that has shown up again in a couple different varieties. You know, we'd be remiss not to bring climate change into the conversation before it's said and done. And one questioner is wondering how, you know, what are some of the biggest impacts of climate change on grizzlies, on their behavior, on their seasonal patterns, food selection. And another is saying, if there are changes from the climate, why are we also seeing bear populations increase?
Rob, do you want to start in?
Sure. So there have been a number of almost certainly climate change attributable impacts on bears already. The loss of whitebark pine in the Greater Yellowstone area was a significant one that whitebark had already been kind of brought to its knees by an invasive fungus back 100 years ago, but Yellowstone was one of the few places where it was hanging on until things warmed up enough that the pine bark beetles were able to get high enough altitude that they could go after the whitebark pine in the Greater Yellowstone area. And they have taken what was a pretty threatened population of trees, and these whitebark pine seeds, biologists measure them on what they call QPUs, or quarter pounder units, because a handful of them is 1,000 calories. It's the same as a McDonald's quarter pounder Happy Meal. So they were just a huge protein source for bears until the pine beetle pretty much erased them from Yellowstone. And that was enough of a significant impact that it overturned the 2007 delisting rule, because they said you did not account for a major loss of food source. Now we are looking at a significant possibility of drying and warming climates having a huge impact on berry crops, huckleberries, service berries, hawthorn, and all the rest of the sugars that bears really work in the fall before the fall hunting season gut piles come available. And if that bears out, then the mountain habitats that bears are depending on are going to see a severe depletion in food resources. As to the person who asked about, now how come we are seeing these growing populations and expanding territories, there's two factors there that are going on. One is we have severely restrained ourselves from killing bears in terms of poisoning and trapping and hunting and other predator management efforts. And so bears have been recovering. They've gone from somewhere between 300 and 600 back in 1975 to about 2,000. Is that enough? Is that too many? That's a huge debatable question. When they're moving out, the question is, does that mean that each of our recovery areas has a threshold, a population? You can have 500 bears in here and the 501st has to go somewhere else. Or is it bears are looking around and going, wow, the big bears have got 3 or 4 times the territory that the younger bears get. And so younger bears are going to go somewhere else. And gee, if there happens to be a cornfield, hey, hallelujah. I don't have to worry about chasing around the big bear. I can just go hit the corn syrup. There's a lot of scientific debate about whether bears are getting pushed out of overused recovery area habitat or bears are adventuring out because why not?
Yeah, I would just add to that. Sorry, we had a thunderstorm started up here in the meantime, sort of all hell breaking loose. But the climate change makes the system more brittle, and bears survive by scant margins. It's about seeking and finding these crops, berry crops, white bark pine crops on the landscape. And so I think that the difficulty with climate change is that it makes a complicated way of life even more complicated. And the other thing is that that's all unfolding in the same time period as we continue to build up and further occupy the lower parts of the landscape that offer different food resources. So what we're seeing is an animal that's a really accomplished generalist being forced, losing certain niches and losing access to foods that they could depend on in the past. So that's what I think is more difficult. And I think it's easy for that change to be masked by the fact that our management and lack of, intense extermination policies is translating to a recovery. So you can have both of those things at once. You can have a recovery and you can have issues from climate change up to a certain point unfolding at the same time.
Definitely. When I was in grad school in Missoula, I did a little research on grizzlies and climate change, and there's evidence of bears denning for shorter windows due to shorter winters, going into the den later, which opens them up to more conflicts with hunters in the fall, coming out of the den earlier, which means they're having more days where they're really hungry on the landscape, which could certainly lead to more conflicts if there's not natural food sources available that time of year yet in large quantities. So it's certainly a factor, but like Bryce said, these are really accomplished generalists. There's also research about how Yellowstone grizzlies, when they lost the white bark pine as a stable food source, began eating more meat. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, very robustly transformed their diet and kept surviving. So they are remarkable creatures, remarkable generalists. And the question is, how will we respond as they adapt to climate change and we adapt to climate change? How will we share some space, or will we decide to share less space? So that's maybe an ending note before I hand it over to Rob, if you'd like to give us a selection from the Grizzly in the Driveway.
Sure. So I don't read my own stuff very well, so I'll do my best to get through it here. My life as a resident and a journalist in Montana overlaps most of the key players in Grizzly country. From listening to friends read the first edition of Jack Olson's Night of the Grizzlies around a Halloween campfire, to interviewing that tight-knit community of scientists and policymakers overseeing grizzly recovery for the Missoulian newspaper, the Great Bear and its impact on people has been an enduring fascination. Early in my career, I got to spend a lot of time with an Episcopalian priest who had honed his storytelling skill in the Oxford offices of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And on a tour of Montana's first capital city, now the ghost town of Bannock, the Reverend Donald Guthrie told me that when he was ordained in Scotland, he signed his name in a church registry next to the name of every previous priest dating back to 1520. Observing that Bannock's gold rush heyday started in 1862 and lasted less than a decade, Guthrie gently observed that Montanans like myself didn't have history. We had current events. Studying history can give the illusion that the world is a static place. We look back at leisure on events preserved between the covers of books. But the history of grizzly bear preservation and the history of human relations with the environment outside our society is evolving as we study it. And like parents on their first night at home with the newborn, we're realizing that our old lives will never usefully inform the problems that we confront now. Historians refer to the last half of the 20th century as the information age. As the pace of change exponentially increased, they started calling the early 21st century the age of acceleration. In kindergarten, I watched the entire focused will of American society allow Neil Armstrong to take one small step for a man and a giant leap for mankind. As this book goes to press, I've got a gizmo in my pocket with more computing power than all of NASA had to get Armstrong to the moon. It maps every step I take, like the radio collars pioneered on grizzly bears. The one thing that smartphone can't tell me is if human powers of decision-making and cooperation have matured at the same pace, nor has it slowed down the avalanche of choices to be made. In that same period, we have packed an additional 3 billion people onto the planet. One of the most frequently cited benefits of wilderness is its respite from all that technology. There you can still hear the wind in the trees as it sounded at the dawn of creation and see the stars in their milky majesty, and spend enough time and your atrophied sense of smell might alert you to the approach of a grizzly bear. Only a handful of animals have the capacity of transforming life just by their presence. I count the grizzly on one of those fingers. Few people have encountered a grizzly bear outside the safety of a zoo enclosure or a car window, but you know every one of your friends and acquaintances who has done so, because at some point they've bragged about it to you. And this is what I mean about meetings with grizzly bears being transformative. It's not just seeing the priest, but the Pope. It's not just a painting, but the Mona Lisa. Your heroism, your cowardice, your dumb luck, or obliviousness in that moment becomes a defining mark on your timeline. And if you want to be scared of something, why not a grizzly bear? We watch them on YouTube videos, but we still see them by the light of cave campfires, fearing or revering the monster outside in the dark. How do you put a price on either the terror or the reverence a grizzly bear inspires? The word fear has two meanings. The most common is an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. The second, known to religious thinkers, is profound reverence and awe, as in, I fear God. I was once obstinate enough to debate this definition with the Reverend Guthrie. Being commanded in the Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer to love and serve the Lord, love and fear the Lord, sounded like an abusive relationship, I supposed. But rather than excommunicate me or even make me polish the silver, Guthrie sent me to the dictionary for further confounding. Part of the etymology of the word fear comes from the Latin periculum, to attempt or risk. The illustration of all those terms could be a grizzly bear. Civilization celebrates human accomplishment. Nature absorbs it. Mountains and rivers and grizzly bears don't care about your credit score or your zip code. When they beat you, there is no complaint form to file, no bouncer at the door to bribe, no judge to persuade. When you win, you feel alive. I fear the bear.
Thanks, Rob. That's a great way to wrap up. So thanks everyone for joining us again this evening. And if you haven't already, do get your hands on these great books about grizzlies, where you can learn a lot more about some of the things we discussed tonight. And we look forward to interacting with you more through Vital Ground social media and email. And any questions that we didn't get to tonight, we apologize. We will try to follow up with you, and hope to see you all either at an event in person or on another one of these webinars soon. Thanks so much for your support of Vital Ground and habitat conservation, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Matt, for having us. And everybody give generously to Vital Ground, because they're doing really good work. Really good work.
So are people in carnivores. We'll talk
right.
to you all soon. Take care.